One of the more interesting and important founding fathers of the memory of the founding fathers, we might say, was Charles Wilson Peale. Peale was a veteran of the American Revolution, an officer in that conflict. He knew Washington and friends, personally. And in the 1790s, Peale is going to found the first history museum in the United States. And he's going to do it in a space on the second floor of what today we call Independence Hall. Peale actually drew a famous painting of himself in the long gallery with a curtain pulled back, teasingly to give people a peek into this first ever museum of American history. It was a museum of both American political history, or they would have said at the time, as Peale did, civil history, but also American natural history. And revealingly, Peale and others of his time period saw these two types of history, civil history and natural history, as of a piece. They believed, consistent with a physicalist view of memory, to which they held very self-consciously and emphatically, that one cannot separate a country's physical history, its geography, for example, and even its material environment, even the weather, from its political history. He builds cubby holes, essentially, all around the perimeter, and he fills these with taxidermically preserved animals, most of which he personally preserves in that way from America. And he organizes them using a Linnaean classification scheme, from simpler animals to more complex, physically speaking, forms of animals, and generally larger, animals as we go along. And he puts them in what he calls a great chain of being that literally goes from the floor of the long gallery, extends to more sophisticated animals, all the way to the top, where at the very pinnacle, we find portraits that he paints of the founding fathers of the United States that circle the room, with George Washington having pride of place at the point of entry, next to an image of an American bald eagle, showing again that connection between American life forms, animals and natural history, and American political history. Peale was so intense about trying to preserve scientifically the evidence, the physical evidence of the greatness of the founders, that he actually lamented that he had not managed to convince Benjamin Franklin to allow him to taxidermically preserve Franklin's corpse. And he was serious about this. He believed that if he had asked Franklin, that Franklin would have acceded, would have allowed it, and that given Franklin's cachet, Peale said, probably I could have convinced other leading founders to do so as well, and we might have a gallery of embalmed American worthies on display. Personally, I'm rather glad that the project came to naught, that he never quite worked up the nerve to ask Franklin. But again, he thought it would have been a go. He had taxidermically preserved Franklin's rabbit, a pet rabbit that Franklin had. So he knew that Franklin knew that he knew how to do this kind of thing really well. Well, what's going on here? This seems like an odd, arrangement to us. Peale saw himself as refuting perhaps the leading scientific critic of the memory of the American Revolution in the transatlantic world. Now, it sounds odd to say there was a scientific critic of that, but there was. There was a French philosopher by the name of Buffon, who is widely regarded as perhaps the leading scientist of his age anywhere in the world, who had argued a materialist view of society, such that Buffon claimed the environment, the physical environment that a country has, irrevocably and inevitably determines the type of creatures that live there, including the type of Homo sapiens, and determines their greatness or their inferiority. This is really the beginnings, hints of scientific racism, essentially. And Buffon had famously argued, as one of his illustrations of this, that he said that the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, had an inferior environment physically and only produced diminutive creatures. and would therefore forever be doomed to produce inferior societies politically. This was a well-known criticism to Americans at the time, and certainly to well-educated Americans like Charles Wilson Peale, and it drove them crazy. Thomas Jefferson, for example, sent a taxidermically preserved moose to Buffon to underscore that there are large, impressive animals in North America. There's nothing wrong with our physical environment. Franklin, this got under his skin, and he critiqued Buffon in this regard. And Peale, with his museum, wanted to prove, again, scientifically, that if you just look taxidermically preserved American animals indigenous to the Americas, they're excellent creatures, biological specimens. And at the peak are the founding fathers themselves. He wanted average Americans to come to his museum and be overawed by those images of the founders ringing the top of this taxonomy. And he wanted them to place themselves, he said, in effect, somewhere between, the animals and George Washington, shall we say, so that they would know their place, so that there wouldn't be another American Revolution. He was bothered by Shays' Rebellion, where average Americans had thought they could rise up again, except this time against the American leadership politically. So he wanted to throttle that back. And in that way, he represented a dominant strand of American political memory that is going to remain dominant, an elitist strand, into the teens and almost into the 1820s.